Human Rights Watch has accused the Egyptian government of severely curtailing the ability of environmental groups to carry out their work, even as it prepares to host COP27 climate summit in November. Now, the campaign group says that the government has forced some activists into exile and others to steer clear of important work. Human Rights Watch spoke to several activists, academics, scientists and journalists working on environmental issues. They said that Egyptian government is harassing and intimidating environmentalists and creating a general atmosphere of fear. The UN's annual conference of the parties, COP, involves nearly 200 countries with hundreds of observers, NGOs participating to tackle climate change. Now, Richard Pearshouse is the Environmental Director at Human Rights Watch, and he joins us now via Zoom from Geneva in Switzerland. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
What are you hearing about what's happening in Egypt?
So we've known for quite a while, since 2014, that the Egyptian government's crackdown on civil society in general has been ferocious. What we've found out more recently through this research is the impacts on its environmental groups. So environmental activists, scientists, academics and NGOs told us about the ways in which the government undermines independent environmental activism in the country. South Africa knows quite well the importance of environmental activists, of legal NGOs, of an independent judiciary, and the role that that can play in forcing the government's hand to confront some of the vested interests that drive the fossil fuel industry and the climate crisis. But Egypt doesn't have those preconditions. So since 2014, the space for environmental activism, independent environmental work that Egypt needs and the world needs, has been severely curtailed by the Egyptian government.
I think you've given us some clues, but why would a government work against such important work?
Well, that's the important question. And so there is some space for environmental organisations in Egypt, but the government channels them into relatively safe and benign spaces which overlap with the government's own interests. There is room in Egypt for recycling groups, for instance. When the groups are confronting other issues, and this research looked into what were the really sensitive issues in Egypt, they're the following. They are when there are environmental harms from commercial enterprises, agribusiness, or the tourism industry. They're when there are environmental harms from military businesses. So in Egypt, the military is closely involved in cement factories and quarrying. When those drive environmental harms, environmental groups can't speak out against it. And finally, when there are environmental harms associated with national infrastructure projects that often have the support of President al-Sisi, again, the people inside Egypt told us that those are the areas where we can't touch, we can't work on them. And so if you ask the question, where is Egypt's climate activism, it's channeled into some very, very safe and benign spaces, but those places where it contradicts or criticises government policies are strictly off limits.
So how does COP27 happen in an environment like this?
Well, that's one of the challenges for the UN that organises these annual conferences. Your listeners may be interested to know that COP28, in other words, next year, is in the UAE, where again we'll be confronted with this challenge of what to do about the domestic human rights agenda and how do we confront those vested interests, and how do we get the climate action that we need? And our message is clear that the governments who are attending COP27 need to, at the same time as participate in those negotiations to get robust climate action at the international level, also speak out in favour of the country's beleaguered environmental movement, because at the end of the day, the world needs more climate activism, not less.
All right. How badly is this curtailment affecting the work of environmentalists and also then, in the end, Egypt itself?
I mean, I think what we'll see in COP27 itself is a greenwashed image. I think the government will say that there's no real impacts, there's no real restriction on space. The government's already preparing those messages. That's false. And so important work, particularly important work around the economy, around the military business complex, and the coal-fired power stations that it requires, that are locked in behind it, those issues aren't up for negotiation. So the Egyptian government will be very happy to talk about the need for other countries to move forward on certain issues. They will be less keen to talk about their own fossil fuel records. And they'll be less keen to look internally at the restrictions on civil society in general, and the restrictions on its environmental movement. And again, the message is clear. The message to the Egyptian government is clear, but also to the countries who are participating at COP27. We're calling on them, obviously, to push for more robust international action, but also to send a message to the Egyptian government that these restrictions on civil society in general and environmentalism in particular have no place, that they're counterproductive to the overall direction of improving environmental governance.
So what should happen, do you think, with the countries that have promised all these funds to help developing nations like Egypt with just transition, with all the work that takes us from A to B, if they are an impediment?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the global challenges, is how do we have the climate policies that we need, but also the just climate policies that we need, the equity behind it that we need. And so that's where, civil society and indeed criticism of the government should be welcome and should be encouraged, because you want to have that feedback. You want to have that test of how those policies are going to go down with the people. And if you're restricting those the space for people to express their views about policies, then you're lining up government policies to fail. We need to have government and people working together if we're to have the just transition that is, a government imperative, but also at the end of the day for people. And so we need to be encouraging more space for debate, negotiation, tests in the courts of law where the judiciary is independent, etc. We can't separate out the human rights fight and the search for progressive climate action. They're one and the same struggle.
I would imagine the fear of reprisals sort of hampers your investigations. Could it be worse than you've reported?
I think we've got a fairly accurate picture of the situation inside the country. We were able to talk to a wide range of people who are working in different forms of environmentalism. It was striking to me the number of people who declined to be interviewed because of fear of reprisals. But I think we have a fairly accurate snapshot on the sorts of restrictions that are in place by the by the Egyptian government. They are restrictions on funding. They are restrictions on registration of NGOs. They're restrictions on research permits. So the government will turn around and say that that sort of work is simply not authorised. And those have been increasingly in place since 2014. I do think that during COP27 itself, we will see some limited space of openness for environmental organisations, but the governments that are attending should be on notice that the real concern is what happens when the world's attention turns elsewhere after the COP27 negotiations. And so the message that should be sent clear and loud to the Egyptian authorities is to open up the space for environmental groups, but then also to keep that space open, to allow those groups to continue to do the important work that they need to do after the world has moved on from COP27.
Were you able to engage with the authorities about these restrictions, and what did they tell you?
We sent a series of detailed questions to the government about their restrictions. They declined to respond. We will continue to ask those questions of the government in the months ahead. And I think that it's not really about Human Rights Watch's role in this. I think there will be a huge international presence from leaders of many, many nations and other government representatives who are attending the COP meeting and meeting with the Egyptian authorities. And so the message, will continue to come from us, but really it needs to be coming from those who are negotiating the terms of the climate agreement that will be reached in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the message needs to be both behind closed doors, but also in public, a message of support for the environmental organisations inside Egypt that aren't able to do their important work.
Richard, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us some insights about some of these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, that's Richard Pearshouse, who's the Environment Director at Human Rights Watch, joining us from Geneva, expressing concerns. An investigation by Human Rights Watch found that Egypt, the host of COP27, is creating a shrinking space for environmentalists in the country in their ability to do their work.